Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we are going to get back to the early 998 and start reassembly, so stay tuned. Now, like I said, we are going to be getting back to the early 998 today. I am super excited about this. I have all of these assembly parts behind me that I have ordered, and now they are finally in. Some of these were pretty hard to find. A lot of people don't ask for ARP bolts for the connecting rods on the 998s, and so those were special order. Thank you so much, 7 Mini Parts, for helping me find those. But we've got all sorts of fun stuff over here. The head sitting over here. Everything's gonna go back together on the top end of the car over this episode and maybe a second episode. I'm not really sure how long this is gonna take me to show you guys. But before we get started, I wanna say a huge thank you to Venom Steel. They sent over some more boxes of gloves for me, and they've given me some additional boxes to give away to you guys in another Classic Mini DIY giveaway. Now, previously the giveaways, relied on subscribers and all sorts of different stuff. However, YouTube has updated their terms of service, so the subscriber situation doesn't really work for giveaways anymore, but I am still using Gleam. The giveaway is a little bit different, few different options to enter, whether you want to go to my social media, visit me here on YouTube, although if you're watching this, I'm guessing that you'll probably already subscribe to the channel, but the link to that is in the description below. One thing is that this giveaway is for North America only, so sorry folks overseas, this one I'm not going to be able to ship out to you guys over there. But if you're interested in signing up and entering that, the winner will receive a box of 100 gloves shipped directly to their house. So aside from that, let's get into the reassembly. Let's start putting together this classic engine. Now, starting off, we are looking at the actual engine block here. And at this point, who knows, if you haven't done this before, you might be a little overwhelmed by seeing a blank block like this. But I've done this a few times on the channel, and I can tell you that as long as you take your time, as long as you do things the way that they're supposed to be done, you won't run into any issues. So the first thing I'm gonna start with is actually on the other side of the engine. We're gonna flip this over, and we're gonna reinstall our crankshaft and our pistons. And so now we're looking at the bottom side of the engine, and it's a little cruddy right now, so I'm gonna get some brake cleaner and I'm really gonna clean up all the different surfaces, all the bearing mating surfaces. I want everything to be spick and span before we start even considering putting the crankshaft back in here. Now, one thing, I am removing these bolts, and the only reason I'm removing these, well actually they're studs, I'm removing them because they're stripped out, they're old and garbagey. I'm gonna get new ones to go in here. I want all this to be new when it goes back together. So whoever gets this engine after me has confidence that there's no problems with this engine. Now, one thing you might also notice is that I'm using a microfiber towel for this, and the reason I'm using microfiber is, one, it was recommended to me by some of the viewers as a great way to clean the, as a great tool to clean an engine like this, because what it does is it doesn't leave any residue behind when you are wiping things down. So you're left with a really clean surface, no debris, nothing like that, which is what you want when you're assembling an engine like this. Now, the first thing that we have are our main bearings. Now, they'll come in a bag like this, and if you guys get main bearings and they aren't sealed in a bag like this, send them back. They should not be delivered uncovered, because these are where the metal surfaces of the crankshaft actually sit down and they rub against it. So if there's any debris, if they're damaged, then they're not worth anything. So in my case, I didn't have to turn the crankshaft, and I also didn't have to machine the block in any way. Very thankfully, all 3 of our main journals were completely great, and they stayed standard, which means that these can go in without any fuss, hopefully. Now, these will get pressed in pretty simply. There's a small tab on them, and that'll get mushed into the tab that's on the block. These are the same on both sides, and one thing that you're just gonna wanna make sure is that this right here, where the actual bearing meets the block, is flush. So I'm gonna touch it on both sides. There we go, flush. This one's not quite there yet. There we go, perfectly flush. And you notice I put that in dry. Also, you're gonna wanna take note, just double check that the hole in your bearing matches up with the journal that's inside the block. So there's a hole right here. That's where oil comes out and lubricates this, this journal face. If that hole is blocked, you're not getting any oil, and you're gonna run into a lot of problems. So repeat this process for each one of these placements. All right, awesome. So now with those in, the next step is to add assembly lubrication to this, and then set our crankshaft down, and we're gonna spin it around a little bit to make sure it spins freely without the caps on. Now here is our crankshaft, and you can see one end is long and the other end is short. The short end is gonna go on the side with this hole and the water pump on it. The long side is gonna go on the side where your oil pump goes. So I'm gonna flip this over. And this is ultimately gonna go in just like that. But first I wanna put some assembly lube on there. And now we'll set this down on here. There's really only one way this is gonna go in here, but you can see, there we go. Spin it around a little bit and get some of that lube on there. And I'm gonna put a little bit more on here. In this case, you really can't be too safe. Assembly lubrication is gonna save your engine in the beginning when you're running it in. All right, so now, as you can see, this is totally free. We're not gonna just leave it here like this. The next step is to install our main caps. So what we're gonna do is take the center cap, we're gonna put it down in there, but first we need our thrust washers. Now, like with the bottom, you're gonna have to put the bearing in here, so don't forget to do that. It's very important because you will need that in order to make this fully work properly. And that has a tab, it goes in very similarly to the bottom side. So I'm gonna put that in, and there we go. You can kind of see what that looks like with the bearing face in it. Now the next thing that we're gonna put in are the thrust washers. Now these are used to space out in between the main cap to create the right amount of infloat on your crankshaft. And basically what that means is that they're made to make sure that the crankshaft doesn't move this way or this way more than the spec says it should be. These come in various different sizes. In this case, these are standard because there was no infloat on it when I tested it, when I took it out. Hopefully it stayed that way with all the work that's been done. If it hasn't, then we're gonna have to get thrust washers that are thicker to take up that infloat, but we'll test that. But first we need to obviously put these in. So first thing I do, this side is the copper side. That is the side that needs to be facing the actual spinning parts of your crankshaft. So on this side, it needs to be faced this way, and then the opposite on the other side. I usually put a little bit of assembly lube in there, and then I rotate it down underneath because it needs to create a circle like this on the other side of this, as well as on this side over here. If that's confusing, post that in the comment section. I'll try and help you out. All right, now those are in place. And the next thing is to put the ones on your main cap. And so we already have our bearing on here. We already have the oil on here. The next is those thrust washers, like I said. Now, one tip is to put oil on there ahead of time, and you can use it as kind of like a adhesive, because obviously it's not real adhesive, but it'll help hold it in place while you're setting this in your engine. And the next step is we are going to torque down only the center cap here to test for any sort of binding. So the way I do that is by taking our new ARP bolts here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and run these in real quick. All right, and with that, we have the center cap torqued down, and it's moving freely, which is super, super relieving. The infloat feels virtually non-existent, but what I'm gonna do to check the infloat is, let's go ahead and set that down there so it's in an easy position. I'm gonna take my rubber mallet, and I'm going to hammer the end of the crankshaft just a little bit, just a few taps to try and get it all the way that direction as I can. Then we're gonna take our feeler gauge and try and measure the space in between the thrust washer on this side and the crankshaft itself. Let's hope we don't have any infloat, because if we do, I'm gonna have to order a bunch of parts. That is really, really tight. What we have is 0.003 inches of infloat there, which is right within spec, which is super exciting. So now we can go ahead and put the other two end caps on this side and torque those down. Now, like with the rest of the engine, you're gonna wanna do this in kind of a crisscross pattern. So right now I'm gonna spin those bolts down until they're just barely tight. And we're gonna do this crisscross pattern to avoid bending our crank at all. Warping it, we don't want any of that. All right, with all those torqued down, crank still spins nice and free. That's what I like to see. So now we have a installed crankshaft. So next up we have the pistons. So what we're gonna do is flip this engine over so it's a little bit easier to see, and I'll show you how to put those pistons in. All right, so now we're looking at the top side of the engine here, and the top side is, well, like the bottom side. This needs to be clean, but we don't have to clean this really intensively until we get to the actual installation of our cylinder head. First, as you can see, all of the studs are gone, and that's so that I can get in here and install these pistons nice and easy. Now the pistons we'll be using are a flat top piston. Originally what were in here, or what I was informed were called the D-top pistons, and they had a small notch up in here. Those got sent out free to someone. I think maybe one of them was salvageable and it could help somebody out, so off they went. But before we put the pistons in, we have to put the piston rings on, otherwise the piston's not gonna seal in here. It's just gonna be bouncing around. So this piston, I put notches on it. If you didn't see how I had disassembled this engine, it's pretty important in terms of reassembly, so check that video out, it should pop up. But let's take this over to the workbench, and I'll show you how to put piston rings on. It's pretty straightforward. Now, putting piston rings on your pistons is not an especially difficult job, but you are gonna want to take a few things into account. When you put these piston rings on, they come in a little kit like this. Almost always they have them numbered 1, 2, 3, and in my experience, 3 has always been the bottom one, and I usually start with 3, and I go down, set the number 3 ring on, then I set the number 2 ring on, and then the number 1. Now putting these rings on is as simple as kind of separating the ring as you slide it down the piston. Take care not to scratch the piston as you go down, otherwise you could lead to small amounts of decompression. And the number 3 ring is a little bit different than the rest of them. It has a small little like spring ring inside it, and this goes on in here, and then this ring goes over that spring, like spring wire. Now I'm gonna call one other thing out when I get to the number 2 and number 1 piston, but let's go ahead and put this one on. All right, and there we go. We've got number 1 ring on, and they're gonna fit kind of loose like that. That's totally normal. Now, when installing the next ring, the number 2 ring, so this ring has a beveled edge on it. You can see that there in the video. This edge needs to be facing downwards. So this is gonna help keep the oil out and the compression in. It's very important that these don't go in the wrong way. Some piston rings have a pit mark on them, like a little mark on the actual ring. If you see that, that needs to go up. Sometimes they'll even read top on the rings as well to help you mount those up. But let's put this on. It goes on the same way that the ring did for the oil ring on the bottom. All right, and now last but not least, we have the number 1 ring. Number 1 ring in this case doesn't have a beveled edge on it at all. It's just a flat ring, so this one can go either way. And there we go. All of our piston rings are installed, looking really good. We basically just need to repeat this for all 4 pistons, and then I'm going to take the bolts. These are the old bolts out of the connecting rods. We're going to take these out and we're going to replace them with ARP studs, which is going to be really nice. Now, the last thing I want to mention about piston rings before we get into actually putting these in, they have a gap in them. You can see that's how you get these rings on here. These, when you set the pistons down into the actual cylinder, you don't want these to be lined up. Normally I make this 180 on the top away from the bottom one here, so 180 degrees out from the other side. Gap, gap, and then this oil ring I'll usually put in between those just like that. But Just want to make that note because I'm not going to call it out when I put these in, and it's important there. All right, so like I said, I am going to be replacing these with all ARP studs here, or ARP bolts. They do come with an assembly lubricant, so you put that on the actual threads, and that is what helps you torque this down and get the best torque spec that you can when putting these on. One thing I do want to call out is that these are pretty hard to find, the ones for the actual 998. Most people just use the original bolts, so I'm really pleased to be able to put these in this engine. It'll be peace of mind for whoever has it. Big shout out to 7 Mini Parts for sourcing these and getting these for me. So let's put the bearings in our connecting rods here. Now, just like our main bearings, if they're not packaged like this, then you need to send them back and ask for ones that are, because they'll be contaminated otherwise. And I would not put opened bearings into an engine, period. So these go in same way the main bearings do. There's a small little tab there that you'll be able to use to notch it into place, and it needs to be flush on both sides. So now what we're doing is we're getting ready to put the piston in, and we'll need a special tool to do this. It's a piston ring compressor, and that's what this is right here. This is just kind of a cheapy one. There's special ones that you can get for each individual displacement. It's gonna make it a lot easier, but this one uses an Allen key thing and tightens or loosens to compress the ring down and then slide it into place. Then this loosens up, and then you repeat the process. Now, one thing I want to mention is that from the bottom end of the engine, which you can see here, we've got our crankshaft and it's rotating around, pretty cool stuff. We are looking at piston number 1 here, so you should be able to see my finger falling down in there. We want to align our crankshaft as such so that the actual connecting point is at its topmost point. This is actually considered top dead center. Where we're at now, where we're going to be putting our first piston in. Now, one other thing, our piston here has an arrow on it, and what that arrow means is it's actually pointing towards the front of the engine. Now, it can be a little confusing with the Mini because it was mounted transversely, which means on its side. And so the front side of the engine is the side that the radiator would normally sit on. So that's the side with the hole where the water pump is, as well as our timing cover will go. So basically the opposite end to where the big long part is sticking out of your engine, which is your flywheel mounting point. So that arrow would face this direction as it goes down into cylinder number 1. Now, like with everything else, we do need to apply assembly lubricant here. We're going to do that on the other side as well. We'll put all of these in, put the bolts in hand tight, and then we'll flip the engine over and we'll torque everything down to spec. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we had a bit of a casualty just now. The piston ring compressor hadn't compressed that ring all the way down. That was my fault, and one of the rings actually snapped. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to put piston number 1 in. I'm going to go ahead and put the rest in, but I am going to have to order a brand new set of piston rings so that I can fit piston number 1.
If you want some love, just let me know.
All right, and so with that, we have all of our pistons on and in place. The next step is to flip this over. Take a little bit of care. These are all pretty tight in there, but there is always the risk of these falling out. So when you flip this over, just kind of, keep a close eye on these. We'll flip it over and we'll finish mounting up those pistons that we could get in, and then we'll move on to some of the other stuff. All right, so now we have a good view at the bottom of the engine here, and what we're gonna do is bring our connecting rods up and into place here. Just like that. So this is piston number 3, as noted here. So we're gonna take the top here, number 3, just like that. And let's get our new ARP bolts out and put those in. Now when putting these ARP bolts in here, there's 2 different methods you can do this. And one is by stretching the bolts. They recommend using a stretch method. And in order to do that, you do need a stretch gauge, which I don't have. So I'm not gonna be able to show you guys the stretch method here. ARP does say that you can install these and simply torque them down. The key there is that you're using their Ultra Torque lubricants. So we need to put the Ultra Torque lube on the threads as well as under the head of the bolt here. Now one other thing about these connecting rod bolts is that there's a chamfered or a sloped edge on the washer. Make sure that that sloped edge is on the side with the bolt head. So I don't really know any other way to explain that to you. Sloped edge needs to meet up with the head of the bolt. So this will go on like this. Let me get my lubricant here. Now you don't need a mountain of this stuff, you just need a little bit. Now there are 2 torque specs. There's a torque spec that comes in your Haynes manual. However, ARP does have their own torque spec, which I will be using on this since I'm using their fasteners. And their torque spec for these bolts is 55 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna tighten, snug these up on both sides, and then we'll torque them down. Very nice. So now we have piston number 1 installed. You just want to give it a little wiggle, make sure that those are spinning freely, and then we'll move on to the next piston here. So we'll meet that up there. I'm gonna add a little bit more lube to this. So now the process is really rinse and repeat. So I'm gonna do the same thing for this one. I'm gonna do it for piston number 4, and then I'll leave piston number 1 alone, empty, until we can get a few more parts. All right, so now we have 3 of the pistons in. We'll be able to rotate this around, and it'll have a little bit of resistance, but you should, if you're stronger, you should be able to rotate this around without any fuss, which I can. Obviously, we're missing a whole piston, so it'll be a little, so it's not totally perfect yet, but we've got the majority of that part done. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this episode of Classic Mini DIY. Now, I know that it probably seems like I kind of cut it off there real quick, and that is because I still have a lot more filmed, but as you guys probably already know, if you're reaching this point in the video, this video is almost 30 minutes long, so I figured now would be a good time to chop it off, and we'll finish the rest of this, or at least the next part of it, in a part 2 episode. So, in that next episode, we'll fix the piston rings on this, we will install the cylinder head, the timing gear, and get the engine top end mostly done. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Post them in the comment section below. And if you like these technical videos, give me a thumbs up. Now, I don't want all of my videos to be super technical like this, but for engine building, it's something I want you guys to see all of the fine details about. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you like the channel and you like the things that I'm doing, consider supporting me on patreon.com/classicminidiy, or picking up some of the parts that I used in this episode from 7 Mini Parts in the links below. But until I see you guys in the next episode, enjoy those minis and motor on.